So first I'm going to introduce myself. I am Kirsten Hunter. I've been working with APIs for almost 10 years now. I've been working actually with REST APIs for that long. I have worked at Netflix and LinkedIn. I worked at 3Scale, which is an API company, and I've spent a lot of time dealing with developers who are very sad about the APIs they're working with. And I've learned a lot about how to design APIs so that developers end up being extremely happy with the experience and you're successful as they are. My presentation style. Yes, I know there's not a lot of words on the slides, so you can't copy them down. I do this on purpose because what happens when I put bullets on the slides is that despite my best intentions, I read the slides to you, and you read the slides to you. We all read together. It's kind of like story time. We all fall asleep. So I will post this. Actually, it's already posted on SlideShare, and there's a blog post at the top of my blog, which is listed here. I love tweets. Sinedra is my username. So please feel free to tweet anything you think about the session, or after the session, if you have any questions about APIs, I love to help people do a better job either using or producing APIs. So go ahead and tweet any questions you have. I've probably run into something similar during my time as an evangelist. So the first thing I'm going to say is your API should be a first-class product, not some sort of appendage on top of your other product, not some unloved thing. It needs to be a first-class product, and you need to treat it that way. Most of the time what we have is there's a mandate from the top. We need to have an API. And so everything you do has to have an API. So the developers are like, oh, yeah, I ran it through Spring in Java, and it barfed out an API. Great. OK, so what do you end up with? You end up with APIs look like they were barfed out by someone who wasn't really planning on how someone was going to use it. It's not usable. And what it looks a little bit like is this here potato, which is the potato you left in the garage for 6 months, and then it grew a bunch of sprouts, and you have no idea what to do with it. So what you need to do is you need to deliberately design your API for the things you want to do. You need to think about it at a much further back level, because your users, your consumers of your API, those developers, are not going to be the same as the people the infrastructure people on the back end. If you don't think about it ahead of time and you have your architects make a REST API, it's going to make a lot of sense to architects, but your developers who are trying to make web applications or mobile applications are going to be very frustrated. So why have an API? I mean, you know, it's a lot of extra work, and now I'm going to tell you that it should be more work so that it's great the first time you make it. One of the problems that we have is that people seem to think that the reason that you have an API is monetization. That is almost certainly not the case. If it's your only product, it should be the case. If you are, so for instance, Twilio, their model is based around monetization. PayPal also has an API, and what do? They make money with it. Every time someone makes a transaction, they make money. But if you're just making an API on top of a regular product, a website, or an application, then you're probably not going to go for monetization. And the reason for this will become clear momentarily. I'm going to take a little break and talk about API First. API First is an industry sort of buzzword. It's almost as exciting as Hypermedia, which I'll talk about later. API First means you have one backend system. It runs the API, and then the API runs your main product as well as your API and any other products that you need to make. This gives you a huge advantage, because what happens normally is that the API grows out of the side, and so you have feature incompatibility, you have problems where you've got code duplication, and so basically you have created this technical debt for yourself. A lot of people will say, can't do API First, too hard, I'm a startup, I don't have time. Or alternately, I'm a really big, important company, and I can't refactor my system. So first of all, refactoring your system, if you have been a developer for a long time, and then you have probably lost some code at some point. You forgot to check it in, your system ran out of power, your system bricked, and now all of a sudden you have no code. And you also know that the next time you wrote that code, it was better. You didn't want to have to write it again, but you learned some stuff the first time that you probably wouldn't have put into place. So think about that for your system, the architecture that you have. API first means that you're going to go back and refactor your back end and and have an abstraction layer between your back end and all of your front end systems, which is significantly better. So little company, your startup, don't have time to do the framework. Okay, it's really easy to make an API shim layer in Django. It doesn't take very long, or your web framework of choice. So I'm not buying that one. But the big company thing, I actually had no answer to that until April of this year when I spoke with Paul from Etsy, and Paul Wright from WRIGHT, if you want to look him up. And he said, oh, Etsy went API first. We did it last year. They just made this change. Last year, they also transacted over $8 billion in American dollars in transactions. So I'm going to have to say they're a pretty legit company, and they made this change. When they made this change, they found a few things that they were not expecting to find. They found that the things that they wanted to happen, better communication between the teams, faster iterations, fewer bugs, happened, but also some of the products that they had not even targeted turned out to be much more efficient and effective. For instance, there is a feed for each person, each seller on Etsy, and they used to generate this asynchronously because it took a few minutes, so they did it every 15 minutes, and it was pretty server intensive, so they didn't want to do it too frequently. The API came along, they changed it to use the API, and whoa, now all of a sudden it's sub-second rendering. It was actually 50 milliseconds or something. It was super fast. And so they made it an actual synchronous call, and so when you make that call now, when you look at that feed, it's up to date immediately. They don't have to cache it. They don't have to do anything like that. And they were really happy with that. So when you're looking at business value, you might be going for mobile and market penetration with your API. And this is actually a great reason to have an API. Even if you're only going to use it yourselves, if you're going to have a website and a mobile device, then you probably want to have an API that feeds both of them so that you stay consistent on both sides. You don't end up with something over here that doesn't really look like over here. What happens a lot of times is that you make a feature on your main product, and the management says, well, you know, when you have some time, go ahead and add that to the API. Because as you all know, developers sit around with lots of extra time and nothing to do with it. So that works out really well. And they also do really high quality work when they're doing something they're not being measured on. So this having the API and as an actual product and even an API first model means that it's going to be successful. But even if you don't do API first, it has to be a first-class product. You have to assign resources to it explicitly and intentionally and make it clear that that is a valuable entity for your company. Market penetration, Netflix is the greatest example of this. So Netflix, they started having an API before, you know, when they were the biggest movie DVD people, and they started having an API and streaming, and now any device that's sold that has anything to do with video has Netflix on it. And it's no longer a competitive advantage to have Netflix on your device. It is now a competitive disadvantage not to have Netflix on your device. They made themselves an industry standard, and one of the ways they did that was by pushing devices to use their API and put their product on it. Driving usage. Twitter is a huge example of this. Twitter would be totally useless if nobody used it. And frankly, their website isn't the most usable thing in the world. And also, when you're on your mobile phone, is when you have this great 140-character thought that you need to share with everybody right now. So having the API means that when you're in a different application, when you're on a different website, when you are somewhere else with something that you want to share, you can share it right away. That uses the API. Twitter is not my favorite API company because I hate them because they have done things that I really disapprove of, like forcing people forward on the versioning and removing XML as an option. So they have made things hard for their developers, but they are successful because they have an API. When they started out, it was a web page, it had a little box, you typed in your 140 characters, and you could add followers. Or you could add friends and follow people. And that was it. All of the other things that Twitter does now, it does because someone created an application on their API, and Twitter then implemented it on their side. So they drove usage and also got feature ideas from having the API. I don't recommend that you treat your developers that way, but it is a good case study. Defensive strategy, getting there first. So Best Buy had an API pretty early in the game. And Circuit City, I would ask y'all if you know what Circuit City is, but I'm in a different country now, so you probably don't. But Circuit City did the same essential thing as Best Buy. They sold electronic stuff and appliances and whatnot. But Best Buy essentially created this integration with a lot of other websites, and they got there first. And Circuit City went out of business. So the same thing happened with Borders and Amazon. The same thing happened, I mean, Barnes & Noble isn't around either. So our bookstores are pretty much Amazon and little independent booksellers that everyone is trying really hard to use so they don't go away. Sometimes you're going to have a technical case. And so the technical case, let's talk about Twilio. Twilio makes telephony easy. Telephony is really hard. If I said to you, hey, why don't you make an app that sends SMSs? You'd be like, that sounds hard. I don't want to, that's not really what I'm doing. And they're like, well, but we want your app to also send SMSs. So then you end up, you can use Twilio. You'll be up and running in 5 minutes, and then your app can send SMSs, and you can focus on whatever your core competency is. SendGrid does a similar thing for email, sending emails, scheduling emails, making sure that they render correctly in HTML in all of the browsers, making sure that you don't have to do the work of understanding SMTP and how to use it most effectively. They do it for you. It's fantastic. And then another example is context.io. And so they sort of do the other side of making email easy, which is they organize the emails in your email box. They'll take actions based on what's in your email box. I feel that I'm not really overstretching by saying that the amount of control you have over your email in the Gmail interface is not at the level that I would like. I would like to be able to manage my email more effectively. I'd like to be able to search it and use it as a storage facility for kind of a knowledge base for me. And right now, it's just not effective at that. So if I wanted to create something for that, I could use context.io. That's a technical use case. That's a business value for them. So the last thing is partner connectivity. And this is actually my favorite one. So what I say about the business value of your API is if you're stuck in the elevator with your CEO, and your CEO says, hey, why do we have an API? And you say, well, because APIs. I mean, they're cool, right? Everyone should have one. Then your CEO says, wow, I'm going to take your engineers away now, and I'm going to give them to someone who makes money. That has actually happened at companies that I've worked for, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience for our developers. So you need to have a real business value. Partner connectivity is one of the best ones. Someone pointed out to me, it sounds a little like lock-in, and it is a little like lock-in. But basically, once a partner has integrated your stuff into their stuff, if someone wants to buy your competing product instead, they have to convince the engineering manager that there's enough value to make it worthwhile to take those engineers that are working on money-making things and reintegrate with a new system. So partner connectivity is a great thing to answer when your CEO says, why do we have an API? Similarly, this is a thing we don't tend to do well, is measure success. So based on our business value, we need to have little charts and graphs we can give to the executive team and show them that we are successfully doing whatever it is that we said we were going to do. I have seen lots of metrics from lots of APIs that say the number of developer keys we have is 100,000. Okay, that's probably not going to be that compelling. The number of people, the number of users using the API, that's more compelling. The number of calls that are using the API instead of the website, that's actually really compelling because the API is very cheap. You don't have to render. You're getting the same information, but you don't have to send the CSS and the JavaScript, and you don't have to. It's a much smaller load for your server. So you have to think about this. Again, we're having a real product, and we're measuring the success in some way that is meaningful to people who are not developers. Now that we have figured out what our business value is and how we're going to measure it, then we're going to make actual use cases, user stories. It may be probably what you want to do is have your main product be one of the user stories. Maybe you don't run your main product on your API, but if you make it so that your main product could run on your API will be very feature rich. And if you make it so that it's easy to make your website using your API, then it's going to be easy for other people to do amazing things with your API. I will talk a little bit about the mobile use case. Mobile is a fantastic use case. If you have a website and a mobile device, you're going to want to have an API for the mobile device. That's really the only way to reasonably use create a mobile application is using REST API. When you are making those use cases, you need to think about what mobile developers care about. They care about two things largely. The first one is, I only want to make one call per screen. So, I mean, you can argue Roy Fielding's dissertation with me until you turn blue in the face, but if you don't bundle your stuff so that people can make a single call and get a screen, they're not going to use your API. They're going to find someone else who's not hearkening to this platonic ideal of the REST system. You need to design your use cases for what you want your users to do and how you want them to do it. The other thing that mobile developers like is small stuff. So we'll talk a little bit about architectural considerations, but let's keep in mind that the phone does not have a big pipe. It has a little tiny pipe. And the larger your calls are, the larger the stuff, the payload is, the more likely it is that the applications will not be performant and people will stop using it. So now I'll talk about architectural considerations. You might think I'm going to talk about how you're going to run your REST API, whether you're going to use Java, or whether you're going to use Python, or whether you're going to run it on AWS with some other system. And let me just tell you, I've seen so many specs for APIs, and they have only that information. All they have is, this is how I'm going to serve REST API to the world. I don't actually care about that. It's not hard. I can make a decently performant REST API server in about 5 to 10 minutes. What I'm interested in is how usable it is for the developers that you want to be using it. So the architectural considerations I'm going to talk about here are much more about usability and much less about scalability. If you don't make a usable API, nobody's going to use it. Then you don't have to worry about scalability. Your problem is solved. So, so try to keep that in mind. Make sure that if you were a consumer of this API, you would be happy to use it. Otherwise, your developers will wander away. So one way that you can deal with the issue of that single call for mobile users or the smaller payload for mobile users is to have expressive queries. For instance, Netflix's devices don't actually care so much about huge payload because what they're going to do after they get this huge payload is stream a movie. So if you don't have a good pipe, if you don't have a lot of bandwidth, the thing isn't going to do very much for you anyways. So they have a query language that allows you to expand the query. So you can say, not only do I want a movie, but I want to know information about the cast and also the director and the producer. And give me some stuff about the genre as well. They actually do have Hypermedia, which I'll talk about in just a second, which makes it possible when you look at a resource to know what other resources you can get that are related to that resource. So LinkedIn has a much more complicated graph than Netflix. I mean, if you think about it, so Netflix has movies and they have people, and they have genres, so that's 3 things. But it's pretty simply based on the movie. The movie is the main thing, and there's these other things that are associated with them. So they can be pretty simple in their query language. LinkedIn wants to be able to support people who want to say, I want to know about my contacts. I want to know what school they went to, what state that was in, and then I want to know what companies they worked at and what state they were in. And then I want to know if they were at my university at the same time I was, or if they were at a company at the same time I was, and then I just want to display that. Or any other list of things that you can do on LinkedIn. They wanted to make it possible to express exactly what you wanted. But even more interestingly and more usefully, they made it so that you could express for each of those pieces of data, each kind of data, what you wanted to know about it, whether it be all of the fields or just one or two of the fields. So that allowed those mobile developers to control the payload and not get more information than they were actually going to use. I talked a little bit about Hypermedia. I'll talk about it again now. Netflix does use Hypermedia. They were one of the first APIs I saw doing that. So when you have data that is very closely linked and you want to make it possible for people to discover the other things that are related to it, whether by making automatic calls with their application or even when they're just exploring through your API, you can have Hypermedia. I'm not going to explain all the different ways you can do Hypermedia, but I will encourage you that if you think that there's a possibility that people are going to want to look at things that are related to what they're calling, look up Hypermedia. Think about it. I'm going to write down real quick API codecs because there's a section on Hypermedia there. This is API codecs. You'll notice that I actually created this, but it doesn't mean it's terrible. I promise it's good. So this is curated information about APIs, and there's a few very, very good articles about some of the people who are doing the best thinking about that at this point. So formatting of your API, again, we're talking about this not in terms of the techniques that you're using or the architecture you're using. We're talking about this in terms of how usable it is for a user. Historically, we had XML. It was the way things happened. There were SOAP APIs, and they were much more contracty, and they were about verbs and the methods that you could call, and things sent back XML. It is still the case now that if you're developers, if most of the developers that you're trying to serve use .NET or Java or C++ or any other compiled language, they will probably be happier with XML. One of the things that Twitter did when they went to the newer version was they got rid of XML, which means that everybody who had already integrated Twitter not only had to move to a different version, if they were using XML, they all of a sudden had to use JSON. So I'm not saying XML is better than JSON. I'm saying you need to consider your users. You need to consider what it is they're doing. If you see a lot of .NET developers, you probably want to make sure that they can use your stuff in the way that's most convenient for them. JSON it's the JavaScript object notation, but it works fine in all of the languages. The interpreted languages like them better than XML. XML is super painful in most of the interpreted languages, by which I mean Python, Perl, Ruby, JavaScript. Those languages really like JSON. It looks like the objects. It's easy for the developers because it looks just the same when it comes back as in the code. Again, though, if all you have is people using .NET, JSON's not going to make them very happy. It is definitely smaller, and the reason that we are using JSON as the standard where people use it instead of both or instead of XML specifically is mobile. As mobile devices became more popular, it became the case that if you were using the XML version of the API, the mobile device would not actually complete the request, whereas the JSON request may have been just fine. So when you're thinking about your mobile developers and the payload, you also need to think about the formatting. You need to think about whether you're giving them information they don't actually need. Who can do what? Authentication and authorization. When we get to the question section, if you guys want to ask me questions about OAuth, I'll totally answer them. But basically, what I want to remind you of is a lot of companies are very afraid of having APIs. They figure, if I make a REST API and I put all my data out there, then everyone can do everything with my data. You have authentication. You can determine who it is. You can determine who owns the application. You can determine what the user is. And you can control what they can do with your data based on that. You cannot give them access to the private data that you don't want to expose. In fact, you could have an internal-only API, and all of the things that I'm talking about will still be true. So authentication and authorization allows you to control the access to your system. Copy. Someone else has an API that looks like something that what you're going to make it the same. make it so the developer who's already using this other API can use your API too. There's a project called API Commons. The idea of that is that everyone can check their schemas into a GitHub repository, and then they can say which version of each, like the user object or the steps or the foods that they're using. And as that happens, we can sort of move towards best practices together as an industry instead of it being the wild, wild west where everyone, sort of huddles in their corner and then poof, out it goes. It's a public API now. Everyone can look at it. So why were you being secret about it last week? It's not a competitive advantage. That is actually in what you're doing with the data. Schema modeling. On my website, also from the workshop yesterday, is an example of running through apiary.io. So Apiary is a company that uses Blueprint, which is one of the markup languages. There's also RAML that MuleSoft has, and there's Swagger, owned by Reverb. What a schema model does is essentially basically what the WSDL file used to do for SOAP. So one of the things about REST that's great is that you can make a REST API really fast. And one of the bad things about it is that you can make an API really fast without thinking about whether anything is inconsistent, whether it fits in with your other stuff, whether your objects are the same when they're called in two different places. If you model your schema, you can also share it with people like your product manager or your customers that you're trying to target. When you use Apiary, you can mock up that API, and they can actually point their clients at it and see if that's going to work out for them or if they're missing some information that's vital. So it's a lot of work, I realize. You want to get right on the making of the API, but go ahead and model it first. And let me tell you, Apiary is pretty fun to use. So, but if you're a JSON fanatic, as I am, you may prefer Swagger. The API evangelist, Ken Lane, he's apievangelist.com, has some conversation, a few articles where he actually looked at all of the different schema modeling tools and determined where they had advantages and where they had disadvantages. And I encourage you to read what he had to say and make your decision based on that. There's no right answer. There's just the right answer for you and your team. However, with Apiary, one of the things that we do at Akamai is we actually use it to control our deployment process. We use it for our documentation. Everything comes out of the blueprint. So since the developers have to make a blueprint in order to deploy their API, they might as well do it up ahead of time so that they can make their product managers happy and not have to do work twice. And then you can do design-driven development. We used to have test-driven development, and that was super awesome for a while, and then everyone got mad about Agile, and it became a religious war, and then nobody wanted to do test-driven development anymore, which was also not the right answer. So design-driven development is I have a schema, I have my use cases, that I've decided how my API is going to work. So now I'm going to actually create my API based on those things. And whenever I make some new part of my API, I'm going to test it against those use cases and make sure they're easy and fast. I'm going to make sure that those things that are server intensive are not so server intensive. I'm going to think about what's slow, because slow is also a problem for use cases. So you're thinking about your users here. Your users are customers, the developers. Okay, developer experience. So I'm gonna tease you Europeans a little bit. The workshop yesterday was a little difficult for me. I'm used to Americans who have big expressions on their faces, and so I kind of model my talks after what people are nodding and happy about, or if they make the confused face or the frowny face. So I figured this guy is a super excited European. See how he's not scowling or grimacing? He's good. So your developer experience is what is going to make your API compelling to developers. We've created an API. It's got great use cases. It's exactly what your developers want to use, but you have to help them. First thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to communicate with them. You know what your business value is. You know what your metrics are. You know what your use cases are. And what we all want to do is keep that secret. We don't want to tell them. They're not grown-ups, and they can't handle the truth. No, they can. They are your partners, and they can handle the truth. And as a developer that is consuming an API, I would expect you to need to know these things about an API that you are basing your product on. You need to know why they have an API, how you're expected to use the API, They need to make it easy for you to get started with that API, just because you need to trust the people whose APIs you're using. The consumer of an API needs to believe that that company really values the API. And telling them everything that you can tell them about the process that you went through to get to that API is going to make them think, hey, maybe this API will still be there in a year after I'm done writing this and I'm getting my $1 from the Apple Store. Asking questions is a very important thing to support of your users. I have learned, one of the things that I really noticed when I first started helping developers to be successful with the APIs I was supporting is that they were so frustrated by the time they got to me that they would say, this is broken, it sucks. Okay, that's actually not helpful. I can't help you with that. They say, well, this happened. And you're like, okay, well, maybe you could tell me what you were doing at the time? And then they say, well, I was doing this. And you're like, okay, yep. What did you expect to happen? So I always tell people to use the bug reporting thing, right? Some of us have probably heard the A, B, C, if this, then. So basically what you want to encourage your developers to do, what Stack Overflow does it as well, encourages people to say, I did X, I expected Y to happen. To my dismay, Z happened instead. And my example I use is I jumped off a cliff, I expected to sprout wings and fly, but to my dismay, I plunged to my death instead. Okay, so there was no bug there. That's pretty much what happens. However, I had a bad expectation, and what you need to tell your developers, your customers, is, hey, that's still a bug. I should have set your expectation correctly. I should have made it possible for you to know what was going to happen when you jumped off the cliff. So honor your users, honor their time, make sure that they understand that you value them. They're giving you the most valuable thing they have, their time. They're never going to get any more of it. So make sure that you help them to be successful by telling them how to ask you questions and making sure your forums are good and support. So marketing, you're probably not interested at all about marketing, but someone in your company is, and they're going to say, I'm going to make some pretty pictures in a brochure, and then the APIs are going to totally be successful. No, that's not what's going to happen. Developers are not the same as regular people for marketing. They want toys. They want to play. They want to engage with the system as soon as possible. So you want to make sure that they can do that. A getting started guide that gives them a tutorial, 5 minutes to first call is the standard that Twilio set up, and I think it's a good one. Imagine, your users, I tweeted last night, your users are wild animals on the Serengeti looking for a watering hole. So they're going to come, look at your watering hole, give you 5 minutes, and if they don't find out what they can do, how they can do it, and why do they care, they're going to leave and use someone else's API. Most APIs don't do a good job of expressing this. What we're good at documenting is resources. But resources are what they get to after they do the getting started, because they're not going to understand how they can work that with the other things that they're using, the other APIs they're using, or their system. So you want to tell them, hey, here's some use cases. We made them up when we were figuring out what our business value is, and now we've made them into tutorials because we care about you and your time. Example code is my favorite thing. I like to make example code. I like to use example code. I hate to write code from scratch. I like to see how other people think and how they solve problems. Don't ever miss out on the opportunity to have example code. And one of the ways to do this is to encourage community participation in a shared GitHub repository, or community participation in their own GitHub repository where you point to it. Support the people who make the example code so you don't have to do the work. This is much better than trying to get them to sort of suss it out without work. Resources. 3 years ago, I gave a talk at OSCON. It was called Demystifying REST. And I was like, OSCON, open source convention in Portland, Oregon. It's full of alpha developers, 3,000 of them. And I thought, it's going to be me and 4 guys in there. It's going to be really, really unattended. Well, no, they put me in a room that would hold 100 people, and 200 people came and sat on the floor and stood in the hallway. Just because somebody is a fantastic developer doesn't mean they know how the web traffic works. Don't make assumptions about what your developers know. It's not going to insult them if you say, here's some resources for you to look at so that you can become familiar with stuff, so that you have ways to debug what's going on. So find out what your users know and make sure you're sharing context with them. Provide tools. API consoles are some of the best things. A lot of people use the Apigee console, which is great. There's also IODocs that Mastery uses. But whatever the case, you want to make it possible, if you can at all make it possible, for people to make calls before they have gone through the authentication dance. You're getting started should help them make that authentication dance, but letting them be able to do it in a couple seconds is great. Apiary, if you use Apiary, it makes you a mock API, and that's actually fine. The developer doesn't necessarily need to see live information. They just need to see what the object is going to look like to see if it has what they want. Supporting your users. Make sure that they know what your SLA is. Make sure that they know how you are going to support them. Are you going to get back to them within 4 hours? Are you going to answer their question within a day? Zendesk is a great product that will pester you if you don't meet your SLA, give you some notifications via SMS or email, and try to get you on the ball of paying attention to your users. But don't sort of leave them hung out to dry. A lot of times when the API is suffering for resources and struggling with resource contention, the forums will be full of nothing. People asking questions, hello, hello, and there's no email, so all they can do is sit on the forum and hope that someone comes by and help. Now, if you've done a great job with your documentation, and you've done a super fantastic job with tutorials, and you've taught your users to do things like use HTTP sniffers and look at the traffic, then hopefully they won't need so much help. You will have sort of pre-helped them. But some people are going to run into problems, and you need to plan for and know how you're going to support them.